Today's date is the 11th of May 2021. My name is Shane Jackson and I'm interviewing Thomas Timbrell for the Memories Captured project. To start with, can you tell me about how you first got involved with blacksmithing?
Yes, I started blacksmithing when I was about 18, 19 years old. It was the second year of university. So yeah, about 19, maybe 20 at the time. And I was studying history at the University of Leicester. And I'd already played with the idea of trying blacksmithing out when I was at sixth form. But when I went to the careers office and talked to them about it, it was always the same response of, oh, blacksmiths, there's not much work for them. It's a dying art. And oh, you'll just be making horseshoes all the time. So that kind of put me off a little bit I did everything. I asked everyone but a blacksmith basically about it. And so it kind of put me off. But yes, second year of university, I thought I'd give it a go. And I tried some night classes at Warwickshire College. And absolutely loved that. Yes, it only did some basic things, but over the course of 7 weeks, one night a week, just gave me a real flavour as to what it would be like. Decided then, you know what, when I finish university, I'll go and do the full college course for this to really experience it. And yeah, absolutely loved it and haven't looked back since, really.
And do you remember what originally inspired you to get interested in blacksmithing?
I think, like many, I had a interest in swords and knives and things, and it's that typical thing, boys liking swords, knives, being quite interested in fantasy and Lord of the Rings, and I was collecting Warhammer, and again, being a history student and enjoying a lot of his different parts of history, I was quite keen on the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. That was the very initial thing, but I've got to say, in those first 7 weeks on the night classes, that was firmly put in its place and put to the back of it all. It was actually really showed me there was a lot more to it. And I think a real big drive for me has always been it's a job that doesn't require you to be in the office all the time. It's physical work and you get to be creative. And again, you can end up making anything with it, which is lovely.
So, can you tell me a little bit about the journey you've had to now having your own business?
So after finishing university, as I said, I went to college to learn blacksmithing. It was while about halfway through the first year of college, a friend and I, we went in together and we brought a old Victorian hand pumped forge, a double bellows forge that we collected all the way from Anglesey in Wales, drove it all the way back to the West Midlands to Stratford upon Avon, and set it up at a living history site, a living museum basically, called Mary Arden's Farm. And started just a couple of days a week over Easter holidays, summer holidays, doing blacksmithing demonstrations, forging little bottle openers, key rings, things like that, little knickknacks for the public. And that really was, for me, the very start of what eventually became Big Bainham's Blacksmithing, the business I'm now running. It gave me a good little chance to test the waters, see what was possible. And on top of that, it allowed me to do blacksmithing in a historic setting, which has become real key, in fact, to the business that I run. Even though today I still make modern items and sometimes some small contemporary sculptures, ultimately history and ultimately everything I do has its roots in history and archaeology. So yes, after setting up doing that little bit of forging at the site, I think I was there. I carried that on, building up the display over the course of about 7 years or so, until I could get my own workshop, take on larger items, I wasn't too sure really when I was starting out what kind of blacksmith I was going to be, whether it would be architectural, whether I'd be making handrails or stairways or things like that, or whether it would be along the lines of sculptural work. And so for the best part of the time of running my business, it was doing anything and everything. But in the last 5 years or so, I've actually found out where I've wanted to specialize. And funnily enough, I've come full circle and I've started to specialize as a cutler. So making, as I said, making the things that drew me to it first, making knives, swords, cutlery, table knives, chef's knives, and so on and so forth. I've come full circle and started making those. And I still do the odd bit. I still work a little bit with fabrication as well, some small scale sculptures. But again, it's mostly the cutlery that is the main focus.
So could you talk me through the process of recreating, say, a kitchen knife?
So forging a kitchen knife, I find they can be you can make them as simple as you want, or you can make them incredibly complex. I try to do everything as traditionally as possible. And again, with history and archaeology being at the heart of what I do, even my modern kitchen knives are usually inspired by some historic example, whether it's a 17th century knife or a knife that Romans were using and that have been found at Pompeii or where have you. There's always usually an element of history or archaeology that has an influence in that. So almost every blade I make will always be hand forged. Either that's from a billet of iron and steel welded together. Sometimes I layer up materials to create patterns in the blade, although we can also use some more modern steels, high carbon steels, keep nice, clean looking materials in there. Forging out the blades, working it through, polishing, grinding, sharpening that blade, heat treating it so it has the right hardness on the cutting edge, but won't be too brittle. And then just as important as actually making a functional blade is putting on the correct handle materials. And I find there's always a balance you have to strike between materials that look nice, that bring out a lovely design, that sort of like work well with the shape of the blade you made and really emphasize the overall item. But also, especially with things like kitchen knives or cooking knives, quite often you've got to bear in mind you need things that are going to be safe for the kitchen to use as well. So historic materials we start to encounter issues there. It's all lovely having bone handled knives, but after a few years you can start getting food and things staining it and it can become a bit unhygienic. So using more and more for modern kitchen knives, I'm using more and more of the more and more modern materials, such as stabilized woods. So woods that have been soaked in resin under high pressure, or polyester or acrylic based materials, cast resin, so that you can have fantastic patterns, lovely colors, even glow in the dark effects in the material to really make it quite unique.
So what are the challenges that you run up against when you're trying to work solely in traditional techniques?
So aside from the hygiene issues that can occur around some of the materials, a lot of those materials also, if you don't have good extraction systems for the air, you can be working a lot with bone and antler. That can be very damaging to your lungs if you are breathing in the dust. Some of I used to work a lot with bone for handles for knives, and recently that has become my least favorite material to work in, because finding bone that has been correctly processed, hasn't been boiled to death, which makes it incredibly brittle. It has become increasingly difficult, and finding it in the right thicknesses, the right shapes to work for knife handles can be a real pain. So it's a lot of the time it's sourcing those materials. to get it correct. And again, when I'm recreating, if I'm recreating a historic blade and trying to adjust that for our modern sensibilities, sometimes the blade shapes look strange to us. They're not something we would consider, or again, people are put off by the use of certain materials as well.
Absolutely. So do you feel like there's any conflict between traditional and contemporary forging techniques or materials?
Any conflicts?
Yeah.
To an element, there is some. There is a big drive for using more modern techniques, and there's nothing wrong with them. And in fact, the vast majority of knives that you will see on shelves in kitchen shops or even produced and sold online, they have almost entirely been used using modern techniques, taking a billet of material, laser cutting a shape out of it, and then grinding it completely to shape, just using a process called stock removal instead of actually forging it to that end shape. And it means that using those processes means you don't need years and years of blacksmithing experience beforehand to be able to make a knife. It can be wasteful in many respects. You can cut out material from sheets of steel, and the parts that you can't fit a knife shape into can get wasted. And that's what I really like with traditional techniques. I can take a lot of the pieces of metal that have been cut off or are end pieces, I can stick them all together and weld them all into one billet and then forge that out and create a new knife from the leftovers, as it were. So there's a huge element of recycling in that respect, whereas the modern techniques don't necessarily allow you to do that. Although, again, there are many people like myself who combine both modern and more traditional techniques to kind of work it all together quite nicely.
Coming back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier, which was that people have misconceptions of blacksmithing being a dying art and being based around agriculture and horseshoes. What are some of the misconceptions you come across in the courses that you run?
So one of the biggest, of course, is, again, blacksmithing is a dying art. I've got to say, from when I started 10 years ago or so, there are now more blacksmiths, a lot more blacksmiths now than there were back then. And of course, things like programs like Forged in Fire have really made it popular. And bladesmithing, again, that's just numbers of people, even if it's just hobbyists doing it in their back garden with a simple setup. It really is, there are now many people around to carry it on. So that's usually one of them. Again, the idea that blacksmiths are making very particular things. They get horseshoes. That's today, especially now, the job of a farrier. And although many are trained to make a horseshoe from scratch, in fact, a lot will buy in pre-made horseshoes and just adjust them. Blacksmiths typically haven't been making horseshoes themselves since about 1950s, 1970s, where the professions split into two very distinct professions there. The idea of your village blacksmith, of course, making horseshoes, making scythes, agricultural tools, whereas today, 21st century blacksmithing, it's a lot more about artistic work. And again, whether what people are doing is blacksmithing. It could be metal smithing, fabrication, and I can tell people that I'm a blacksmith, and then they'll expect me to be able to weld together huge reams of what have you and make huge barbecue sets and things. And although I've now learned how to do those kind of things, again, that's tilting more onto the end of fabrication. It's not necessarily what blacksmithing is at its heart, which for me and for many is you need to have stock change. You need to have to change the shape of materials while using heat, heating up the material and hammering it and making the end shape change, basically.
Almost following on from that, then, what do you think is the most surprising development that potentially change the way that you forge something or you create a piece of art in metalwork?
I think the development of certain tools and certain methods. I'm currently quite interested in looking at induction forges. So a forge that will heat up metal by using alternating magnetic fields. It all starts getting incredibly high tech. And it's an area that I'm no expert in, but I'm somewhat fascinated in how they could be used, especially for bladesmithing and heat treatment of blades, from what I have seen and how they operate. There's an element that they can make certain stages in that a lot easier. And also, instead of like using a gas forge or a solid fuel forge, you can light the thing and there's usually a warm up time and it takes a bit of time to get going. A lot of things with induction forges, you can flick a switch and it's ready to go. There are also new cutting methods where using similar technology, wire can be used, laid into a shape, and it can cut through steel. So you can cut very precise shapes out of steel. Again, to be used, whether that's for making knives or for actually making the components of the knives, extra details for handles. It can be utilized in many ways. But one aspect that I'm really hoping we can use in the future is actually 3D printing. It's a huge untapped resource. Some people are waking up to it, others are quite reluctant on it. But there are levels that 3D printing can be used to, if you can scan, let's say, a historic object, maybe you are interested in making a particular sword from a particular culture and the museum is on the other side of the world. If you can arrange a 3D scan of that object, they can scan it, they can send that information to you, and you could potentially 3D print it for yourself. So you could then study in further detail the ins and outs, the designs, the dimensions, and then work on a recreation without having to actually go to the item. As much as that is nice to actually see it in the flesh, as it were, you'd be able to work on items from across the other side of the world with a greater degree of accuracy.
So thinking about heritage, particularly the really interesting way that you will dress for period appropriate attire and eat the food that they would have eaten. How did you get into that?
So at university, I briefly tried out spending a bit of time with a Viking reenactment society that was part of the university, just to sort of dip my toes in it. And it was all at the time when I was kind of figuring out what I was quite interested in, what was really drawing me to certain regions of history. Again, I was studying history at the university. So I was still finding, I had a wide scope that I could have gone with. I was still finding the topics that really interested me. I kind of found that that group wasn't for me, but I managed to find a group local to where I was living at the time that were focused on the Iron Age and Roman Britain, and the invasion of the Romans in Britain. And it was during joining with them, going to events with them, learning about that whole world, the whole world of reenactment and living history and how that's developed, and being able to combine that with my interest in history in general, but also with my experience as a blacksmith over the years. It's just been a case where I've found that myself and my partner, Caroline, we have just been throwing ourselves deeper and deeper into that world, trying to look at every aspect, to experiment with it, whether it is absolutely eating the exact same food that we can find out through research and archaeology, or whether it is through recreating things like iron knives from certain hill forts in Britain and testing them out to see how strong they were, copying them right down to studying the metallurgy of the knives, so we can get the composition right. again, to experiment with these, see if they were effective. Did Iron Age swords bend like some of the authors from the time were writing about? Were they all of them poorly made, or were actually any very good? You know, how effective were they? Could they cleave a man into things like this myth busting as well? It really, as soon as we start going deeper into that, it gets incredibly fascinating, and you go down the rabbit hole. You start one bit of research, it leads on to the next, and before you know, yes, you're dressing up, you're going and living the life as best as you can, and looking for sites where you can spend extended periods of time experimenting on these ideas, and trying to get a sense of what it would have been like to live at the time as well.
Definitely sounds very, very immersive. What kind of sense of connection do you get to the past when you're recreating events and recreating the techniques they would have had in the forges?
I've got to say, actually, after recreating many different, specifically focusing on the Iron Age, recreating a lot of the items, some of the swords, some of the knives. Of course, myself being a blacksmith, it's almost always iron work that I'm recreating, although I do a bit of bone working and woodworking as well to test out, to try and expand the items that I'm making, and really try out a wider variety. And you usually find that making iron tools goes hand in hand with those processes as well. You make the iron tools and then you do the woodworking. I find that having done this, recreated these items, tested them out, I start to see connections when, if I'm watching a documentary on tribes in Africa or in the Amazon, you can start seeing with them, you can see similar tools in some cultures and societies that have been largely untouched by the 21st century or the Western world. And you can see some of the tools they are using are direct copies or descendants, or basically they are the same as the Iron Age tools that we've been recreating. You can see people who use those items on a daily basis, and you can start to join up what you're seeing in the archaeology, what you've recreated, and actually someone living and using it with experienced eyes in the 21st century. So it's basically ethnoarchaeology, and you're seeing these connections. So there's that. Also, again, we can read descriptions of how the Iron Age Britons were fighting, let's say, or how the Celtic peoples were fighting you, and we can look at what the Romans are saying, and we can find old documentaries from the 20th century capturing intertribal warfare in Papua New Guinea, and it's incredible in that you can see those similarities between what Julius Caesar is describing about the Iron Age Britons when he comes and fights them, when he tries his invasion, and what these tribes and how these tribes in Papua New Guinea are fighting, the movements, the ebb and flow, the skirmishing, the javelins being thrown, the arrows being shot. You can really see it, and it might give us a bit of a glimpse into it, and it's hoping that we can join those dots together to further understand all of what we read in the sources, see in the archaeology.
So how do you see that work progressing? How do you see future generations taking up the mantle of research and recreation?
Well, fortunately, it seems to be a really strong growth in things like experimental archaeology. Year on year, there are more and more people. Only the other day as well, my partner and I were just doing a few activities for the Scouts, just a local group near us. And we had a young girl there who came up and said, "So you're living historians? That's what I want to be when I'm older as well." So it's amazing that there's that coming from such a young age group already. And it's getting people to take it a step beyond as well. You're going from living history into experimental archaeology, trying to write it down, trying to record these experiments as well, get people into the discipline of doing that, as well as ourselves. We need to write an awful lot more of what we're doing down so we can test it over years and years. And as this continues, there will be, and there already is, a stored knowledge growing and growing. That means for the next generations who come into this world of living history, they'll have access to the results of experiments that we didn't have when we were starting out 10 years ago doing this. And new archaeological finds will come to light. We'll be able to analyze them better. And we always say to people who are at our shows, you know, how we're dressed now, what we're telling you now is on some of the latest research and experimentation and finds. But come to us again in 5 to 10 years, we'll probably tell you everything we said was wrong. And this is what it is now, because so much more has been found. So we hope that, you know, there will be more who will join in. And as the years go by, they'll have that information. They won't have had to go down all the false routes that we have had to and make all the mistakes that we've had to.
Going back a little bit to what you said about there being a revival and sort of growth of interest in blacksmithing, do you think part of that is down to current trends around sustainability?
There's certainly a strong element of recycling within blacksmithing. It's, for me, it's always taking nothing and turning it into something. When you start out as well, you're trying to scrimp and scratch at every little bit of scrap metal you can get hold of, trying not to have to buy it in, trying to get any old bit, whether that is people bringing you old bits of farm equipment, or whether it is going to your local garage and asking for any old car springs that they might be throwing out. And giving that all a new lease of life, turning it into something new that can be used again for another 10, 20, 50, 100 years. So there are some blacksmiths and some metalsmiths who focus entirely on just using recycled materials. Certainly within bladesmithing and cutlery, there has become a larger push as well of using sustainable materials and less of a draw of using some of the endangered woods. So you can still get hold of things like pink ivory and mahogany and ebony woods and Macassar ebony, but more and more of us are moving away from them and trying to, if we do use them, we're making sure they've been sustainably sourced or they haven't come from the wrong places. But also, yes, trying to use renewable materials and trying to be more cautious in how what we're using. And again, instead of demanding new, fresh steels to be created, there's a whole wealth of scrap and rubbish out there that can be turned into fully functional items.
Maybe thinking about those materials which are more rare and thinking about practices which are maybe being a bit lost. Can you talk about how you came to be, I want to get this right, a specialist in making folding knives as part of the sort of Heritage Crafts Association?
So out of all the knives that I do make, I've got to say over the last few years, I really find that folding knives have really taken an interest for me. And so the Heritage Craft Association has the list of endangered crafts, and folding knives is on there. A folding knife maker now, there's typically a lot of this is based around what the cutlery industry was in the 17th century in Sheffield, and goes from there into what it is in the modern day. And although I do make modern folding knives, I always am trying to look further back in history to see what examples there were and recreate them, because there are some incredibly fascinating things. I mean, the Romans, we think of Swiss Army knives, but the Romans already had essentially Swiss Army knives, folding knives, where you could also have a fork and a spoon that will fold out of the piece. Um, I mean, we think of sporks as modern inventions to eat foods with a spoon and fork, but yep, the Romans, the Saxons, they were already there, and even folding knives. People having the idea in their heads on displays, people can be quite surprised that I have them when I'm demonstrating the Iron Age, because we think of folding knives as quite a modern thing. So when I'm standing there with a replica of one that's dated to 600 BC in Austria, from the Iron Age, and people are amazed that from as far back as then, we were making folding knives. So for me, it's certainly about going back as far as we can, find those very early examples, produce them, show people that this history extends even further back. And within them, there are techniques that are lost or we just don't use anymore. And there are materials, fantastic materials. I love using ram's horn for folding knives. It's a lovely material to work with on its own. But it's also material I find that comes up again and again and again in the archaeological record. So yeah, get back on using those materials as well, which I really like.
So, reflecting back on sort of your entire career as a blacksmith, what do you think are some of the most important lessons you've learned from blacksmithing?
Well, that's a big question. um, I've got to say, a lot of it has been don't be afraid to try something yourself, and there's some people are put off by the fact that others may have done what you're trying to do before, and there's not a problem if you're making something someone else has made something before. Okay, a lot of people try to copy other people's work, but if you are going to do it, look at it again and see if there's something you would do to change it, to develop it further. Go that step beyond. Try and always think of, especially if you're making items that are meant to be functional, and items that are meant to be used. Don't just look at them as that. Look at them with a level of pride. See if you can make something beautiful and functional. Again, why I love knives, why I love making them. It's not just about making a really useful tool. It's about making something that actually has a really nice aesthetic to it, really carefully choosing the materials you use in it. Take your time to design something, take your time to look at it, and really draw that inspiration from anything. If something really speaks to you, really makes you passionate about it, go with it. Don't just make something because others are um, others are doing it as well. Uh, you can find that you might go off on a tangent, you might head down a route, but in doing that, you might learn a technique that will come out of nowhere at some point and help you elsewhere. And a lot of it is interchangeable. When you can if you can make a nail, you can certainly step forwards and make the next item and then the next item, and it all builds and builds. And there are also a lot of people out there with a lot of knowledge about it. So it really is worth talking, cultivating friendships around the craft. There are people who will be more than happy to help, and finding your niche. Find your niche, because you will. There's so much you could potentially make. If we think about everything that's been made in history, there is a niche in there for everyone to really explore. Um, as blacksmithing really can be limitless.
And finally, do you have a favorite project or commission that you've worked on?
I've had a few, I've got to say, and they can vary greatly. One of the ones I'm certainly most proud of and really enjoyed making was a sword it was a sword actually that was found last year, an Iron Age sword that was found relatively recently last year over in Wales. And I had the chance to make that make a replica of it for the Museum of Wales, experiment with creating the correct grain structure and layering in the metal to test that out on a pig carcass for a documentary as well. And it's one of the items I'm most proud of, but I think while that itself was a really, really nice sword that a lot of effort and a lot of time went into, I flip back and forth between that and some 17th century cutlery I've been working on recently. Again, we quite often think of knives and swords as being, big cooking knives or large medieval swords or things like that, but actually very delicate cutlery where you have to spend your time filing details into the handle, where the item becomes akin to jewelry, not just an eating knife. So I'm very fortunate to get a chance to work on a recreation of three 17th century Dutch knives, some of which are going to be inlaid with mother of pearl and have gold leafing on. So I'm quite privileged to get to work on something as delicate and complex as that, and those are really shaping up to be currently my favorite pieces to be working on.
It's definitely really interesting because there's so much technicality that goes on with making smaller pieces. I think when I've mentioned that I was first researching blacksmithing, people would point me towards sort of man-at-arms or forged in fire, where they do the big bastard 1.5 hand swords, and they're sort of, it's all about the spectacle sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, the one Forged in Fire has been fantastic in getting people interested and making it visible, but also Forged in Fire shows a very small amount of what blacksmithing is, and even then a large portion of when I've watched it, a large portion of it isn't even there. It's more metalsmith work. It's a lot on knife making, modern knife making, where the forging quite often, other than trying to put a pattern into the metal, the forging itself doesn't make up a huge amount of what the end result is. It's an awful lot of grinding. It's not finishing an item on the fire to as close to the end product as possible, and then running them through incredibly rigorous tests. No medieval sword was meant to try and cut a bullet in half. No sword was meant to chop blocks of ice. And this is perhaps one of the major misconceptions when we deal with swords, and especially looking in the Iron Age with swords. We tend to think when you're fighting with swords, you're hitting your blade against the other opponent's blade loads of times. They need to be tough and they need to be able to hack through big chunks of wood and things like that, when the reality is many of them were never designed to deal with that kind of stress and to be hit against anything that tough. We've always got to remember these things were always designed to hit the person, the soft squishy thing, as quickly and as early as possible, and finish the fight as quickly as possible. So even if a blade received damage on its cutting edge, well, that's why it's nice to have two cutting edges, because you can turn it round and carry on fighting. It's fantastic for making it more visible, but the reality is it's a very 21st century way at looking at items from the past, and it's a very specific way at looking at it, about just showing, can you make the toughest thing, not can you make the most practical, the most usable, the most accurate reproduction, which is especially on that accuracy of the reproduction of the original item. That's especially where I really focus on. And so that's the kind of difference.
Okay, unless you've got any questions or anything that you feel we've missed, I'm happy to wrap up there.
No, I think I'm all good. Thank you. I hope that's what you've needed.